Tony Stark enters the Marvel Universe as a man who seems to have everything: money, fame, intelligence, and power. To the world, he is a billionaire playboy genius, smiling under bright lights and applause. But beneath that confidence lies a fractured soul shaped by neglect, guilt, and unhealed trauma. Tony's story is not about becoming a hero, it is about learning how to live with the weight of his own mistakes. From the very beginning, Tony is defined by expectations he never asked for. Born into the shadow of Howard Stark, a cold and emotionally distant father, Tony grows up craving approval that never fully comes. His brilliance becomes both his shield and his prison. Intelligence replaces affection, innovation replaces intimacy, and sarcasm becomes armor against emotional vulnerability. The turning point of Tony's life comes not in a laboratory, but in captivity. When he is kidnapped and forced to confront the consequences of his weapons, Tony is stripped of his illusions. The Iron Man suit is not born out of heroism, it is born out of fear, survival, and guilt. From this moment on, Tony's life becomes a continuous battle between who he was and who he desperately wants to become. As the Avengers form, Tony finds himself surrounded by people who challenge him: Steve Rogers' morality, Thor's godhood, Natasha's silence, Bruce's inner monster. Yet despite being among heroes, Tony remains painfully alone. Leadership does not come naturally to him because leadership demands trust, and trust requires vulnerability, something Tony struggles to give. Tony Stark's journey is ultimately a tragedy disguised as triumph. Every upgrade comes with a cost, every victory leaves a scar, and every sacrifice pushes him further away from peace. His life is not about winning battles, it is about losing pieces of himself to protect a world that may never truly understand him. 1. Emotional neglect from his father Howard Stark. Howard Stark admired Tony's genius but failed to nurture his heart. Praise was rare, affection even rarer. Tony grew up believing that love had to be earned through achievement. This absence shaped his emotional isolation long before adulthood. Tony internalized the idea that being extraordinary was the only way to be worthy. This pushed him toward perfectionism, arrogance, and emotional distance. Vulnerability felt like weakness because it was never modeled for him. Even after Howard's death, Tony remains haunted by unresolved feelings. The lack of closure becomes a permanent ache, influencing his relationships and fueling his self-destructive tendencies. 2. Becoming a weapon maker at a young age. Tony inherited Stark Industries without fully understanding the moral weight of its work. Weapons became products, not consequences. His genius was exploited by systems larger than his conscience. Over time, the reality of civilian deaths caused by Stark weapons breaks through his denial. Each realization adds another layer of guilt to his psyche. This guilt never leaves him. Even when he changes paths, the past continues to define him, shaping every decision he makes as Iron Man. 3. Kidnapping and trauma in Afghanistan. Tony Stark's kidnapping isn't just a plot event, it is the violent death of his old self. For the first time in his life, money, fame, and intelligence fail to protect him. The man who once controlled rooms with arrogance is reduced to a body chained to the floor, gasping for survival. In that cave, Tony learns what true powerlessness feels like, and it terrifies him more than any enemy ever will. Watching his own weapons tear through innocent lives forces Tony to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. His genius had been fueling suffering, not security. The realization fractures his identity: he is no longer just a creator, but a destroyer. This moral awakening is born not from philosophy, but from blood, screams, and unbearable guilt. Even after escaping, Tony never truly leaves the cave. The trauma follows him home, embedding itself in his mind as anxiety, insomnia, and panic attacks. His body is free, but his nervous system remains trapped. The man who jokes the loudest is quietly reliving terror every night. 4. Survivor's guilt, Ensign's death. Ensign's sacrifice saves Tony's life, but it condemns him to a lifetime of guilt. A good man, kind, selfless, and brave, dies so Tony can live. That imbalance never makes sense to Tony, and it never stops hurting. This guilt becomes the emotional engine behind Iron Man. Every suit, every rescue, every sacrifice is an unconscious attempt to repay a debt that can never be settled. Tony doesn't save people because he wants to, he saves them because he has to. Tony never truly forgives himself for surviving. Instead, he keeps moving, building, fighting, hoping that constant action will drown out regret. Redemption becomes a horizon he chases, knowing he may never reach it. 5. The burden of being the smartest one. Tony Stark carries the silent weight of expectation wherever he goes. Every crisis automatically turns toward him for answers. People assume intelligence equals emotional strength, but it doesn't. Tony is expected to know what to do even when no right answer exists. Failure feels illegal to him, not human. His brilliance becomes a cage disguised as praise. The smarter he gets, the lonelier he becomes. No one asks if he's scared, only if he has a solution. His mind never rests because the world never lets it. Mistakes feel catastrophic, not forgivable. Tony cannot afford ignorance, hesitation, or rest. Being needed turns into being used. He becomes a function instead of a person. Others lean on him without seeing the cost. His fears feel childish compared to global threats. So he hides them behind sarcasm. Being surrounded doesn't mean being supported. Being relied on doesn't mean being loved. Tony stands in rooms full of people feeling unseen. Genius makes him essential, but never understood. 6. Constant fear of failure. Behind Tony's confidence lives a relentless fear, the fear of not being enough. No matter how many times he saves the world, he believes the next failure will be the one that destroys everything. Every new suit isn't an ego project, it's armor against insecurity. Each upgrade is Tony whispering to himself, maybe this time, I'll be ready. Fear fuels his brilliance, but it also drains him. Innovation keeps him alive, yet it slowly burns him out, leaving exhaustion where pride should be. 7. The Avengers' internal conflicts. Teamwork challenges everything Tony believes about control. Sharing responsibility means sharing blame. Tony fears chaos more than disagreement. The Avengers aren't just teammates, they're mirrors. Each clash exposes Tony's insecurity. Steve Rogers represents faith Tony doesn't possess. Where Steve trusts ideals, Tony trusts preparation. Their arguments aren't about strategy, they're about fear. Tony believes disaster is inevitable. Steve believes morality can prevent it. Tony feels reckless freedom will get people killed. Steve feels control will strip humanity away. Every disagreement fractures trust. Tony begins to feel like the villain among heroes. Leadership becomes loneliness. Unity becomes emotional warfare. He wants to belong without surrendering his instincts. But compromise feels like vulnerability. The team fractures, and so does Tony's heart. Family becomes a battlefield instead of a refuge. 8. Ultron, the weight of playing God. Ultron is born from Tony's deepest terror. Not evil, but anticipation of loss. Tony sees threats others can't imagine. So he tries to stop them alone. Ultron is meant to protect humanity from itself. But protection without consent becomes tyranny. Tony assumes responsibility no one asked him to take. He believes he must act before it's too late. Fear replaces patience. Urgency replaces wisdom. When Ultron turns violent, Tony realizes the truth. Power amplifies intention, but also flaws. Creation without humility becomes destruction. Tony doesn't fear Ultron, he fears himself. The failure proves intelligence isn't enough. Good intentions don't erase consequences. Lives are lost because Tony rushed salvation. The guilt becomes unbearable. Playing God costs him faith in his judgment. This mistake never leaves him. 9. Sokovia guilt. Sokovia becomes Tony's emotional breaking point. The destruction isn't theoretical, it's personal. Every collapsed building feels like a confession. Every civilian death feels like his fault. Tony doesn't see collateral damage. He sees names he'll never know. The scale of loss overwhelms him. Victory feels meaningless. Heroism feels hollow. He internalizes responsibility completely. No excuse eases the weight. No justification silences the guilt. Tony replays every decision endlessly. He wonders what he missed. What he rushed. What he ignored. Sokovia proves that intentions don't protect lives. The realization devastates him. He stops trusting himself. Guilt reshapes everything he believes. 10. The Sokovia Accords. To Tony, control feels like accountability. Regulation feels like repentance. He believes limits can prevent disasters. Freedom now feels dangerous to him. Steve sees trust as moral necessity. Tony sees oversight as survival. Their disagreement is rooted in pain. Tony has seen consequences firsthand. He doesn't want another Sokovia. He doesn't trust unchecked power, especially his own. Supporting the Accords feels like penance. Like admitting fault publicly. Tony isn't thinking politically. He's thinking emotionally. Fear guides his logic. Regret guides his choices. He believes surrendering autonomy equals safety. Even if it costs him friendships. Even if it costs him identity. Tony chooses restraint over pride. 11. Civil War and loss of Steve Rogers. Civil War destroys Tony emotionally. Not because of ideology, but betrayal. Steve was his moral counterbalance. His quiet compass. Losing Steve feels like losing family. Trust shatters beyond repair. The fight isn't about laws. It's about broken faith. Tony feels abandoned. Left alone with his guilt. Steve walking away hurts more than any punch. Tony feels unchosen. Unforgiven. Isolation consumes him. He loses the one person who challenged him honestly. Silence replaces brotherhood. The Avengers no longer feel like home. Tony retreats inward. Pain hardens into defensiveness. The loss changes him forever. 12. Discovering his parents were murdered. The truth reopens wounds Tony buried as a child. Grief he never processed resurfaces violently. His parents' deaths stop being accidents. They become acts of cruelty. Shock turns into rage. Memory turns into pain. Logic collapses under emotion. Tony feels robbed of closure. Robbed of forgiveness. Anger overwhelms restraint. Reason becomes irrelevant. Pain demands release. Tony lashes out destructively. Violence replaces dialogue. This moment exposes unresolved trauma. Loss resurfaces without warning. The child inside Tony screams. The adult cannot calm him. Grief consumes judgment. This fracture scars him deeply. 13. Peter Parker's death in Infinity War. Peter becomes Tony's emotional anchor. The son he never planned to have. Protecting Peter feels instinctive. Almost parental. Tony sees innocence in him. Potential. Hope. Watching Peter die breaks something permanent. Helplessness returns violently. Tony promised to protect him. And failed. Peter's fear echoes endlessly. Tony blames himself completely. This loss eclipses all others. It feels unnatural. Unfair. Unforgivable. Guilt becomes unbearable. Survival feels undeserved. This moment defines his despair. 14. Defeat by Thanos. Thanos represents Tony's worst nightmare. An enemy he cannot outbuild, cannot outthink, cannot stop. Defeat feels humiliating, existential. Tony realizes preparation isn't enough. Power doesn't guarantee victory. Fate feels indifferent. Sacrifice feels meaningless. Hope fractures. Confidence collapses. Tony questions everything he believed. Fear overwhelms ingenuity. Loss feels inevitable. Failure feels permanent. The universe proves uncontrollable. Tony feels small. Powerless. Almost broken. 15. Fear of time travel. Time travel terrifies Tony deeply. Not because of danger, but loss. He finally has something worth keeping. A family. A future. Sacrifice now has consequences. Tony fears losing everything again. He fears resetting happiness. Love becomes vulnerability. Choice becomes unbearable. Duty clashes with desire. Heroism feels cruel. He hesitates, not from cowardice, but from attachment. Time travel threatens stability. It threatens peace. Tony fears regret more than death. He fears empty arms. He fears absence. Love becomes his weakness. 16. Choosing the final sacrifice. Tony understands the cost the moment he sees it. There is no calculation, no debate, no search for alternatives. Some choices don't ask if, only who. And Tony Stark knows it has to be him. For years, he prepared for every threat imaginable, yet this moment requires something no suit can provide. It demands his life, not his intelligence. Redemption doesn't come through invention now, it comes through surrender. He chooses responsibility over survival, because that has always been his true evolution. The man who once ran from consequences now walks directly into them. Where fear once controlled him, love now guides him. He chooses the universe over himself, because protecting life finally matters more than preserving his own. He chooses others over legacy, sacrifice over safety. This is not a desperate act, it is a resolved one. Tony does not panic. He does not beg for time. He accepts mortality with calm clarity, because his purpose is finally complete. There is no escape plan this time. No backup suit. No miracle solution waiting in reserve. Only resolve forged through years of failure, loss, and growth. The cycle of guilt ends here. The burden of responsibility ends here. By giving everything, Tony becomes everything he was meant to be. This is not just his death. This is his redemption made permanent. 17. Dying as a hero, not a man at peace. Tony Stark saves everyone. Not symbolically. Not partially. Completely. The universe survives because he stands when no one else can. Lives continue because he chooses to end his own. This is heroism in its purest form, final, selfless, absolute. But peace never finds Tony while he breathes. Rest is something he earns only at the end. His life does not close in comfort or forgiveness, it closes in meaning. He gives everything he has left. Even breath. Even time. Even the future he finally wanted to live. There is no dramatic speech. No victory celebration. His death is quiet, because true sacrifice doesn't need applause. It is definitive. It is earned. It is irreversible. Tony dies a hero, but not a man untouched by pain. His scars don't vanish. His losses don't rewind. What disappears is the weight. The guilt. The responsibility he carried alone for so long. Giving was how Tony Stark learned to love. Giving was how he learned to lead. And giving is how his story ends. Not as a billionaire. Not as a genius, but as a hero who gave everything, so the world could keep going. In the Avengers, Tony was often misunderstood. Seen as arrogant, reckless, or controlling, few realized that his need to prepare was rooted in terror. Tony didn't build suits because he loved power, he built them because he was afraid of being powerless again. Afraid of another invasion. Afraid of another child dying because he failed to think ahead. When Tony finally chooses to snap his fingers, it is not an impulsive act, it is acceptance. Acceptance that some burdens cannot be shared. Acceptance that peace for the world may never mean peace for him. In that final moment, Tony becomes what he had been trying to be all along, not a genius, not a billionaire, not a soldier, but a protector who chooses love over life. Tony Stark dies the way he lived after becoming Iron Man, giving everything, asking for nothing, and carrying the pain so others don't have to. He doesn't leave behind a perfect world, but he leaves behind hope. And that is his true legacy, not the suit, not the technology, but the reminder that even a broken man can choose to save everyone else.